It was 3 a.m. when I woke up to the unmistakable sound of silence, a silence that should have never existed. The soft hum of my dad's oxygen machine, the one that had been running non-stop for years to keep him alive, was gone. I wasn't awake for long before I felt that familiar pang of dread. You know, the kind that tightens in your chest when you know something's wrong but can't quite put your finger on it. I fumbled around in the dark, trying to get my bearings, and that's when I realized the app on my phone wasn't showing any connection to the machine. Panic crept in as I rushed down the hallway to my dad's room. The sight that met me still haunts me. He was there, lying in bed, pale, barely breathing. His lips were turning blue, and the room was dead quiet except for the faint, frantic sound of my heartbeat in my ears. The oxygen machine that had been keeping him alive for years wasn't running. It should have been a gentle, persistent hum, but instead, it was still, lifeless. I could see the blinking red light, that dreaded warning signal, but it was too late. My mind raced. I froze, trying to process what was happening. What do I do? My dad's life was in my hands at that moment, and the panic of not knowing how to help someone gasping for air, the kind of panic that comes when you realize that you've never trained for this, and you're doing this entirely alone, was suffocating. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, and then I started CPR. I'd seen enough movies to know the basics. Push hard, push fast, but that's it. I wasn't certified. I didn't know how to save him, but I was desperate. Each breath I tried to give him felt like it took every ounce of strength from me, my hands shaking as I pushed his chest, praying the paramedics would get there in time. The minutes felt like hours, and every second without oxygen for him made the stakes higher, more terrifying. When the EMTs finally arrived, they rushed in. But I saw her then, Karen. She wasn't in the background either. No, she had to make her presence known. She walked in with that smug expression, arms crossed in the doorway, like we were the ones disturbing her night. She actually had the nerve to say, "It's too loud. You're making too much noise. I can't sleep with that thing running." Can you believe that? My dad was dying in front of her, and she was complaining about noise. This wasn't a loud neighbor situation anymore. It was life or death, and she wasn't even fazed. One of the paramedics turned to her, obviously shocked, and said, "Ma'am, you might have just killed someone." She didn't seem to care. In fact, she was more annoyed that we were creating a disturbance in her quiet little world. Now, I'm not the type to escalate things unless I have to, but at that moment, I was holding on by a thread. My whole focus was on whether or not my dad would survive this, whether I could somehow pull him back from the edge. I didn't know how deep Karen's involvement went in this, but I sure as hell knew this wasn't just a random noise complaint. There was something much darker at play, and Karen, standing there judging us, seemed to be at the center of it. The thing is, I had no idea how far she was willing to go, how much she thought her comfort mattered more than anyone else's life. So let me back up a bit. You probably have an image of Karen in your head by now. Every neighborhood has one. But this one, she was a force. The vice president of the HOA. Some of you might think that's a volunteer position, a bit of a hobby for people with too much time on their hands. But for Karen, it was her kingdom. She ruled the neighborhood like it was her own little fiefdom. You could forget about doing anything without running it by her first. Forget the fact that she was supposed to be ensuring the neighborhood stayed nice or tidy. Karen had become obsessed with her own sense of control. If the grass on your lawn was a shade too green, or your mailbox wasn't aligned just so, you could expect a citation. She was the embodiment of the word rule, and not in a good way. You didn't just follow her rules. You had to understand why her rules were the only rules that mattered. Now I'm sure you're wondering, why did she care about my dad's oxygen machine? What's so loud about it? Well, let me tell you, Karen's definition of noise was skewed at best. She'd complained to me multiple times about things that weren't properly in line with her vision of the perfect neighborhood. The first time was when I put up a wind chime. Yeah, you heard that right. She gave me a citation for making emotionally disruptive sounds with it. She actually told me that. Wind chimes, emotionally disruptive. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. But still, I didn't think much of it. Who would think Karen could stoop so low as to mess with someone's life support? I mean, we're talking about a medical device here, not just some random piece of noise-making equipment. But this is Karen we're talking about. So yeah, it's exactly what happened. She'd filed a formal complaint against my dad's generator, the one that powered his oxygen concentrator during power outages. And just to be clear, this wasn't some noisy, cheap piece of equipment. No, it was a quiet medical-grade unit, designed to make as little noise as possible. You couldn't even hear it from inside the house, let alone across the street. The thing was insulated, kept in the side yard, practically hidden from view, and designed to hum at a barely noticeable decibel level. But apparently, it interrupted Karen's meditation. She'd complained multiple times, but the HOA hadn't really taken her seriously until that night. The storm had been mild, just enough to make the lights flicker, but that was enough for Karen to finally take action. I checked the generator before going to bed. Everything seemed fine. It was all set up, ready for the backup kick-on in case the power went out. I went to sleep at midnight, thinking everything was okay. But at 2:56 a.m., the power did flicker just long enough to trigger the generator. That's when Karen decided enough was enough. In her silk bathrobe of power, she snuck across the street, walked into my yard, and yanked the plug from my father's lifeline like it was just another appliance she didn't want to deal with. She thought she could stop the hum and make her night peaceful again. But she didn't stop to think about what happens when someone plays with someone else's life. Because when she unplugged that generator, she was gambling with my dad's life, his oxygen levels dropping by the second as he slept, completely unaware. That night, Karen didn't just kill the noise. She came dangerously close to killing my dad. And what made it worse? She thought she was justified. She had no idea that the loud machine she was turning off wasn't just an appliance. It was a lifeline. And she didn't care. She didn't care one bit. When I first noticed the silence, I didn't think anything of it. After all, power outages happen all the time, and I had checked the generator just before I went to sleep. I had checked everything, made sure it was ready in case the lights flickered. So when they did, I figured it was just another brief inconvenience. But the fact that I didn't hear that familiar hum, that soft whir of the oxygen machine working overtime to keep my dad's lungs from shutting down, set off a wave of panic I wasn't ready for. As I fumbled with my phone, trying to connect to the app, nothing was coming through. The app, which normally gave me real-time data, was just showing a blank screen. That's when I felt the dread hit my stomach. It wasn't just that something was wrong. It was that I knew it was bad, really bad. I rushed to my dad's room, barely taking the time to grab my shoes. When I burst in, I saw him. He was lying there, still and pale, like he was sinking into the bed. His lips had already started to turn blue. I could see the terror in his face, even though his eyes were closed. He wasn't moving, not even the slightest twitch, and that's when I saw the blinking red light on the oxygen machine. That's when it clicked. It wasn't just the power flickering, it was Karen. She had done something, and whatever it was, it had cut off the one thing keeping my dad alive. I didn't know what to do. I could barely breathe myself, but I had to keep it together. So I dialed 911, hands shaking uncontrollably, praying they would get there in time. I dropped the phone, and I started CPR on my dad. I wasn't trained for this. I didn't know the right way to do it, but I knew I had to try. Every push felt like a battle. It felt like I was fighting against time, fighting against something I couldn't see. But I kept going. The desperation was overwhelming. No one teaches you how to handle a situation like this. I was doing everything wrong, but I didn't care. I just had to make sure he stayed alive. I remember the tears running down my face, but I kept pushing. I couldn't think of anything else. I couldn't lose him. It felt like forever before the EMTs showed up, but when they did, they were nothing short of amazing. They worked quickly, professionally, and they wasted no time getting him stabilized. But then, just when I thought I could breathe again, there she was. Karen. She appeared out of nowhere, walking into the room like she owned the place, acting like we were the ones causing a disturbance. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pursed like she was the one being inconvenienced. I couldn't believe my eyes. She was still standing there, as my father lay barely alive in front of her. Her first words weren't apologetic, or even an acknowledgement of what had just happened. "No," she said. "It's too loud. You're disturbing the peace. I can't get any sleep with that machine going off." It took everything in me not to shout at her. "Are you kidding me? My dad is fighting for his life right now, and you're complaining about noise?" The paramedics, clearly shocked by her lack of awareness, didn't hold back. One of them looked her right in the eye and said, "Ma'am, you might have just killed someone." But Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him like he was the problem. She said, "I didn't know it was medical. It just looked like a noisy box." I wanted to scream, but I just couldn't. My dad was alive for now, and that was the only thing that mattered. Karen was already trying to deflect, trying to make herself out to be the victim, trying to turn the situation into one of inconvenience for her, as if my dad's life wasn't even worth a second thought. The paramedics weren't having it. They immediately turned to the police, telling them about the tampering with medical equipment. They could see through Karen's flimsy excuses. She unplugged the machine during a medical emergency. She's the reason it wasn't working. They didn't even give her a chance to talk her way out of it. As they got the story straight, Karen started to backpedal, spinning a new tale every time someone asked her about it. She said she thought the machine was abandoned. No one had told her it was for medical use. Then she said it was an accident. "I tripped over it," she claimed. Like that somehow made it okay to mess with someone's medical equipment. I wasn't going to let her lie her way out of this, especially not when my dad's life had been on the line. I remembered the cameras. My doorbell cam had caught everything. I wasn't going to let her get away with saying it was an accident. I knew exactly what I had on those recordings. So when the police asked me about any footage, I didn't hesitate. I showed them the video. There she was, Karen, in her robe, walking across my lawn, calmly unplugging the generator, and then leaving as if nothing happened. I had to watch the footage a few times, just to make sure it sank in. But there it was, no denying it. Karen wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The police officer turned to her with the footage on his phone and asked, "So, you're telling me this was an accident? You just tripped and unplugged it?" She was caught in her own lie, but she doubled down. "I didn't know it was medical. It didn't say anything on it. I couldn't hear the warning labels. I couldn't believe what I was hearing." The device had 3 red medical warning stickers on it, each one large enough to see from a distance. She had to literally look past those stickers to unplug it. There was no way she didn't see them. But she didn't care. She didn't care about my dad's health, his life. She didn't care about anything except her own comfort. The officer looked at me, then back at her, and I could see the wheels turning. It was clear he knew what had happened. But Karen, as always, was playing her role, trying to pretend like she wasn't at fault. When the officer asked her if she had anything to say for herself, she tried her best to deflect, acting like it wasn't that big of a deal. "I thought it was just some noisy box," she said again. this time with a shrug, like that made it okay to put my dad's life in jeopardy. What kind of person behaves like that? What kind of person thinks their peace and quiet is more important than another human being's life? I had no answers, but I knew one thing for sure. Karen had to be held accountable for this. That's when the cops told me they had to send everything to the DA for review. They didn't arrest her on the spot, but I could tell they were pissed off, and they should have been. What she did wasn't just a noise complaint, it was criminal. There was no way around it. But the thing that hit me the hardest wasn't just what Karen did. It was the fact that she didn't even seem to feel any remorse. She didn't apologize or offer any explanation other than her own comfort. It was like she genuinely thought she was in the right, and that made me sick to my stomach. What kind of world do we live in where people like her get to hold that much power and use it to hurt others without a second thought? As the officers wrapped up their statements and left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute. This was something much bigger. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not now, not ever. The next day, I barely slept. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. It wasn't just the near-death experience of my father that haunted me. It was what Karen had done. She didn't just make a noise complaint. She took a deliberate action that endangered my dad's life. I wasn't about to let that slide. I knew the HOA would cover for her. They always did. They were her enablers. So, I had to take action, and I had to make sure it wasn't just forgotten in the shuffle of suburban life. That's when I started gathering everything I had. The footage from the doorbell camera, every email I'd ever received from the HOA, any letter they'd sent me. Anything that could show just how far Karen was willing to go to get her way. I wanted to make sure she knew this wasn't something I was going to let disappear. I started digging into the HOA's history, looking for anything that could tie them to Karen's behavior. It didn't take long before I realized something deeply unsettling. The HOA had already proven time and time again that they were willing to side with Karen no matter what. When I'd moved back into my father's house, the complaints had been minor. Little things like how my yard didn't have the approved flower arrangement, or how my wind chimes didn't meet the exact decibel level in Karen's mind. But that was just the start. The HOA had backed her up in everything. When Karen had complained about the generator's hum, the HOA didn't bother to check if the machine was properly installed or if it was medically necessary. They just took her word for it. And then, to make matters worse, they emailed me the next day with an accusation. They accused me of violating a noise ordinance that hadn't even been in place the day before. The email wasn't just a threat, it was a cover-up. They had actually created a new policy to justify Karen's actions. They had retroactively added a clause about unauthorized emergency equipment, making it seem like the generator was somehow a violation of the neighborhood rules. But the kicker? This wasn't just an accident or an oversight. They had changed the rules to cover up Karen's behavior, and they'd done it after my dad's machine had been sabotaged. I wasn't going to let that go. Not now. Not when they were trying to cover their tracks. I knew that if I wanted to hit back, I had to go for the heart of the problem. The HOA was protecting Karen, but Karen wasn't the only problem. It was the system, the way these people thought they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. That's when I decided to take the next step. I called a lawyer, a guy named Daniel. He was a specialist in HOA abuse, someone who knew exactly how these things worked and how to fight back. The moment I explained what had happened, he didn't hesitate. "This is bigger than a civil dispute," he told me. "What she did is criminal, and it's not just her. The HOA might be implicated in this too. If they knew and did nothing, they're complicit." I could feel the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just about getting a personal apology from Karen. This was about making sure she was held accountable and making sure the HOA felt the sting of their actions too. The next few days were a blur. Daniel immediately went to work, helping me file complaints, gather evidence, and put together a case. We even pulled the footage from the doorbell cam, showing Karen sneaking into our yard and tampering with the generator. We had the emails from the HOA, showing that they'd manipulated their rules after the fact. The documents were enough to make my blood boil. Karen didn't just sabotage a piece of equipment. She'd been playing a game the entire time, using her position in the HOA as a tool to harass people she deemed a nuisance. But I wasn't the only one who had a problem with her. The more I dug into her history, the more I realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. Karen had been abusing her power for years, pushing people around, intimidating them with fines, and making their lives a living hell. It wasn't just about my dad's generator. This was bigger. Karen had been trying to push out elderly residents from the neighborhood, trying to make life so miserable for them that they would leave on their own. Her little campaign of neighborhood revitalization had nothing to do with making things better. It was about controlling who stayed and who went, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. It was becoming clear. Karen had overplayed her hand. She didn't think anyone would fight back. She didn't think I would push back this hard. But I wasn't backing down, and neither was Daniel. He told me he was going to take this to the district attorney, that this wasn't just about a noise violation. This was about criminal negligence. What Karen did wasn't just reckless. It was calculated. She'd intentionally unplugged my dad's oxygen machine, and by doing so, she had delayed life-saving care. And now, the DA was going to have to take a hard look at everything. I felt a strange sense of justice starting to build. There was something cathartic in knowing that this woman, this monster in a robe, wasn't going to get away with it. It wasn't just about my dad anymore. It was about the whole neighborhood. People had been quietly suffering under Karen's rule for years, and now they were going to have to take a stand too. I wasn't alone in this fight. But even as I started to feel the pressure on Karen building, I knew that this wasn't over. No, this was just the beginning. It was one thing to file complaints, to put together the evidence, but the real battle was going to come when Karen and the HOA realized I wasn't going to let them bury this. I wasn't going to let Karen sweep this under the rug. That's when I got a letter, certified mail, a legal document from Karen's lawyer. It wasn't just any letter. It was a cease and desist, accusing me of defamation, demanding that I stop spreading rumors about Karen and her actions. I laughed when I read it. She was threatening me with legal action for telling the truth. Can you believe that? Here she was, trying to kill my dad, and now she was worried about her reputation. I forwarded the letter to Daniel, and when he saw it, he couldn't stop laughing either. "Cute," he said. "I'll handle it." This was getting real, and it was about to get even bigger. It didn't take long for things to go from bad to worse for Karen. The moment the news got hold of the story, everything changed. Once they saw the footage of Karen, in her bathrobe, walking into my yard and pulling the plug on my dad's life-supporting machine, they knew this was something worth covering. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It was about the kind of power abuse that could ruin lives, and Karen was about to become the poster child for every HOA nightmare anyone had ever endured. I couldn't even keep up with how fast the story spread. It hit Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook groups about HOA horror stories. People who had dealt with power-tripping HOA officials like Karen were sharing their own stories. Neighbors from nearby communities were chiming in, telling their own tales of ridiculous fines and rules that seemed designed more to control people than to maintain a neighborhood. It was like a tidal wave of public outrage, and suddenly, Karen was the face of everything that was wrong with homeowners associations. But what really threw Karen into a panic wasn't just the media coverage. It was the emails I started getting. I didn't know who was sending them, but the information I received was shocking. Someone from the neighborhood had sent me screenshots of Karen's private HOA group chat, and what I found in there made my blood boil. It was a conversation where Karen had been bragging about her plans to get rid of the noise menace, my dad's oxygen machine. She referred to it as a noise menace, as if my dad's need to breathe was some inconvenience she had to deal with. And it didn't stop there. Karen had been in cahoots with a local real estate developer. The plan was clear: push out elderly residents like my dad, raise HOA fees, and make life unbearable for people who didn't fit into her vision of the perfect, quiet neighborhood. The conversations in that group chat were so incriminating, so full of disdain for the people she claimed to be protecting, that I couldn't believe it. Karen wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was using her position to manipulate the entire neighborhood to her advantage, to push out the vulnerable, all while lining her own pockets in the process. I knew right then that I wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. I was fighting an entire system that had allowed her to flourish. With the group chat screenshots in hand, I forwarded everything to Daniel, my lawyer. He was beyond furious, but at the same time, I could feel a sense of satisfaction building. We now had the smoking gun we needed. This wasn't just about one woman who couldn't stand a little noise. This was about systemic abuse, and we were going to expose every last bit of it. It was time to go after the HOA. We weren't just looking for a simple settlement anymore. We were going after them all: Karen, the board members who'd turned a blind eye, the entire corrupt system that allowed her to thrive. Daniel didn't hesitate. He sent a formal complaint to the district attorney's office. He made sure the DA had everything: emails, footage, witness reports, the group chat screenshots, everything. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about making sure the people who had covered for her were held accountable too. The moment the DA got involved, it felt like everything shifted. It was no longer about what Karen did. It was about what the HOA did by enabling her. And trust me, the pressure was starting to mount. But Karen, true to form, wasn't backing down. She wasn't the type to fold when things got tough. Instead, she tried to dig in her heels even further. She sent out a brand new letter to the neighborhood, trying to paint herself as the victim. She accused me of making her look like a villain, like I was spreading lies and ruining her reputation. The letter was a piece of work. She even claimed she was just trying to maintain peace in the neighborhood. She tried to rewrite the whole narrative, but it was too late. People had already seen through her lies. The backlash against her was so intense that she started unraveling in front of everyone. Neighbors who had never spoken up before were now coming forward with their own horror stories. People who had been too afraid of Karen's influence in the HOA were now speaking out, telling stories about her constant harassment, about the ridiculous rules she imposed, and how she'd pushed them to the edge. Karen had made too many enemies, but it wasn't just the neighbors who were done with her. The remaining HOA board members, the ones who'd been too terrified to stand up to her, started to jump ship. One by one, they resigned. It was like watching the last pillars of Karen's kingdom crumble. Sandra, one of the quieter board members who had always stayed in the background, posted a resignation letter to the community board. It was a subtle but telling message. She didn't call Karen out by name, but it was obvious. She said that the HOA no longer served the interests of the residents, that recent events had made it clear the leadership was corrupt, and she could no longer be a part of it. And then, just like that, more board members followed suit. Before long, Karen was the last one standing. It was the beginning of the end for her reign of terror. The moment the board started to fall apart, things shifted dramatically. The DA's office contacted Daniel, and that's when things got real. They were taking the case seriously. It wasn't just about a noise complaint anymore. The charges against Karen were stacking up. We were talking about criminal negligence, about tampering with medical equipment, and even reckless endangerment. She wasn't just looking at fines or a slap on the wrist. She was facing real consequences. And let me tell you, when I heard those words, criminal negligence, reckless endangerment. It felt surreal. Karen, the woman who had sent me fines for everything from the color of my mailbox to the sound of my wind chimes, was now staring down felony charges. And it was happening because of her own choices. Meanwhile, Karen had gone into full damage control mode. She showed up to a neighborhood meeting, trying to explain herself. The whole thing was an absolute joke. She came in with charts, actual printed charts, trying to justify her actions by showing how loud my dad's generator was. She pointed to my property, the one that had almost cost my dad his life, and said, "As you can see, this house has become a disruptive force in the community." Someone from the back of the room shouted, "Lady, you nearly killed a man!" The crowd erupted into laughter, and you could see Karen's face twitch. But she didn't stop. She kept pushing her narrative. She tried to reframe herself as the victim, claiming that she was just trying to do what was best for the neighborhood, that she'd been mischaracterized. But by the time she finished her speech, it was clear. No one was buying it. People were fed up with her, and they weren't afraid to show it. When Karen finished her speech, someone threw a foam gnome at her. I'm not kidding. She stormed out in tears, and the whole room let out a collective sigh of relief. Watching her leave, knowing she had been publicly humiliated, felt almost too perfect. She had built her little empire on petty rules and meaningless complaints, and now it was coming crashing down. I had no sympathy for her. Not after what she did to my father. Not after everything she put me through. Watching her unravel in real time was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But it didn't stop there. With Karen out of power and the HOA in disarray, the neighbors took matters into their own hands. There was a meeting, and this time, it was different. This time, everyone showed up. People who hadn't been to an HOA meeting in years were there, fired up, ready to put an end to the madness. It took hours, but when the vote finally came in, it was unanimous. The HOA was dissolved. They shredded the bylaws, revoked the rules, and just like that, the neighborhood was free. People were cheering, hugging, celebrating. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like we were finally free from the suffocating control that Karen and her cronies had imposed on us. Someone brought cupcakes. It felt like a party. My party. And it was the best feeling in the world. But even after all of this, there was one more thing that had to happen. The legal battle wasn't over yet. Karen was going to face the full force of the law, and I was going to make sure she paid for what she did.